Hello, hello. Today we're going over the Unit 1 of US History. Let's get right into it. Here's the organization of the presentation. You can pause it right now if you'd like, but I'm going to move on ahead. First, we have some key vocabulary. ACE doesn't really define, hey, these are the 5 important words you should know or anything like that, so I've picked out a few here that I think are the most significant. We have manifest destiny, which is a belief that people have the God-given right to conquer more land. Pretty much, this is what made Americans want to move westward with all their expansion and led into the Mexican-American War. Then we have the Fugitive Slave Act, which the North really did not like. It was made in 1793, and it said if a slave escapes, he must be returned over. This caused a lot of tension, a lot of drama, because essentially it meant that slavery could technically exist while in northern states. But we'll get into that with way, way later. Then we have popular sovereignty, which is where residents from a territory can vote on if they want slavery. This caused a lot of tension, mainly the bleeding Kansas and stuff like that. And now we have our first question. How was the issue of slavery addressed between 1820 and 1850? So slightly before 1820 slash during 1820, we have the argument of whether it should be slavery or not. The North thought it was morally wrong in every way, that all men were created equal, which is said by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, while the South, they thought it would increase their profits a lot to have people working that weren't getting paid. And this is true. If you don't pay people, you do get more of the money. And part of this was because the South was more farmland, more, I don't want, rural, I want to say, while the North had a lot more of the factories getting started up. So they had different advantages in their own ways. And not to mention, there was general racism at the time. We don't have to beat around the bush here. And John Locke was a popular philosopher who said all men should have the right to life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson changed that to happiness, like the pursuit of happiness, but if you go with property, then it really supports the South's view. Okay, then we have the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820, both are the same thing. The cause of this was adding Missouri into the United States. There's a really big crisis over whether it would be a slave state or a free state. And the reason why this balance really mattered because in the Senate, they would send 2 representatives from each state into the Senate, and they would vote on these very important things. So if you have a bias of those who are against slavery or those who are pro-slavery, we see how their decisions are going to be affected by that. The solution was to this was to make this compromise. The first part was Missouri would be a slave state, and the second part was Maine would be a free state. It was already a state, they just made it so slavery was outlawed. And the third most important part was that no slavery would be allowed above the 3630 latitude line for all the new territories. And this did work for a very long time, but it was around 1854 where this was invalidated later on. So it was putting a band-aid on a broken arm. It didn't solve the issue, but it made them last a while. And here's just a little map showing you the 3630 line, how it would extend to that new territory. And we have some significant bits. And when I was looking through the textbook for this class, he only had like one small paragraph about each of these little things, so I figured it was important to at least mention them, as it gives a lot of context for where people stand on slavery. In 1787, there was a 3/5 compromise, which was when they were trying to decide how population would be counted in states, and pro-slavery states had a lot of slaves. Yet they weren't really considered people, so they decided, hey, why not make them 3/5 of a person? That way, in population, the South would get more representatives for the House of Representatives, while still making them not have an extreme amount of people. It was wrong overall. We can see how calling someone 3/5 person is not good. Then in 1793, they made the Fugitive Slave Act. We talked about that a bit earlier, where if a slave had escaped, the person was required to return the slave back to his owner, almost like if you had a lost dog and you had to return that dog back to its owner. 1820, Missouri Compromise. Then 1831 to 1844, there was the gag rule, which was passed by the Senate to make it so the House of Representatives could not discuss slavery at all, which is sort of bad because slavery was a very prevalent part of life, so silencing that part of not even politics but daily life, we can see how even if America was founded on free speech, there clearly isn't free speech in that kind of scenario, but it was nullified later on. We see that by ending in 1844. Then in 1832, we have the nullification crisis, or the Calhoun Doctrine. Basically, I believe it was South Carolina that was trying to put its own taxes and tariffs on its own property and state, but the federal government had something that would contrast that. And the end of this was sort of a lawsuit, but it ended up with the federal government winning. So whatever the federal government decides would overrule what the state decides, which I think is very important, even though this was about the economy, that could translate over to slavery, where now the states understood the federal government could absolutely control the situation if they wanted to. So we see a further lack of action, for example, 1820 Compromise, not fixing the situation. That has a really big impact later on. Then in 1846 to 1848, we have the Mexican-American War, which we'll get into right here. The cause of it was a border dispute, making Texas a state. This was manifest destiny. The United States wanted a bigger state. Mexico wanted to keep some more land. So we have the Rio Grande at the way bottom. That's where the United States went and Texas, while on the other hand, Mexico went at the Nueces River, right there. And the outcome of this, well, there's a few outcomes. There was the Wilmot Proviso, the rise of tensions over slavery in general. A lot of these events, you could say, there's a rise in tensions, and also an American victory from the war. An effect of this was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Alright, so there's a lot of words on the slide, but if you have to take one sort of short sentence summary, it's what's at the top, where the Wilmot Proviso was a failed proposal, but it created the Free Soil Party in the end, because this dude, David Wilmot, he was a congressman. He was like, so this new land we got, Texas, is gonna be a lot, right? So he suggested that there shouldn't be any slavery in these territories. It's a lot of land, but the South felt really upset at this. They were wondering why they should fight in the war if they can't even extend their own state rights over it, if they can't even decide if they want slavery. But the North saw it was valid. The majority of the Senate was from the South, and President Polk fought for Texas more than a lot of Northern territory because he was a very expansionist president. And he was making other land purchases as well, and he was fighting a whole war over Texas, while the northern areas he just paid a lot of money, right? And we also see some of these political parties start forming. Some of them are formed a little later, like a few years later, some are formed a few years earlier. The line is blurry, but we have the summary of them here. Democrats want sovereignty of the people, which can mean popular sovereignty in the same way. The Whigs existed to oppose Andrew Jackson, which I think is sort of a funny formation, and generally they supported the national government. The Know-Nothings were anti-slavery. Anything else, they know nothing, that's why they're called that. The Free Soil Party exposed the expansion of slavery, that's why the Wilmot Proviso created that political party. The Constitutional Union wanted to avoid talking about slavery, they just wanted America to stay together. At this time, they didn't have much significance, but later on, when we see a two-party system, this is sort of a popular party to get into, where they don't want to talk about it at all. And the Nativist American, there's anti-immigration, that's sort of all they stand for. Alright, and going back to see our effects. So, we see the effect was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I didn't make a slide on this, it wasn't very significant overall, it was just that America got the border that they wanted and paid some money for Texas. That was really all. But the more important thing is that people start focusing the Mexican-American War as a war over slavery due to the Wilmot Proviso, right? Because if David Wilmot's like, yo, we're gonna make this new land this, then everyone's gonna think the war is about that overall. So, in order, the federal government tried to relieve all these tensions caused by this by making the Compromise of 1850. They would make California, which was also admitted, into a free state, and they also made slave trade banned in Washington, D.C., but the area still continues having slavery. They just want to be an exchange of slavery into that land, right? And in addition, there would be a stronger Fugitive Slave Act for the South, and also New Mexico and Utah would have popular sovereignty. We sort of see how it's divided into North on the left and South on the right. So we see how, even though they're trying to make more compromises, more agreements between them, they're still sectionalizing them overall. And, I mean, both sides were happy over this, so it wasn't the worst kind of agreement, but it really depends on where you set the bar, because the Civil War is only 10 years later. So now we need to look in how and why did these sectional divisions widen between 1850 and 1856. We have the effects of the Compromise of 1850. It barely balanced peace because the federal government still didn't pick a side, and adding California as a state led to the Gold Rush, which also led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We'll get into that a bit later. First, we have to go into Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a book written by someone from the North that represented all the cruelties of slavery. It represented the slaves in a very good light. It represented them as heroes who were very selfless overall, right? And the masters as very cruel and mean. The North got educated by it, and abolitionism grew a lot, while the South felt like it was very harmful with propaganda and even countered it with pro-Southern literature that was inspired almost a parody of this. I remember something similar to like Aunt Clara's Cottage or something like that, like very clear parodies of it. And then we have the election of 52, not that long after. The Whigs die in this one, that's the main significance of it. We see a little map here. Popular vote is generally almost equal between Pierce and Scott, but electoral vote, 86%, that is not good, so this is the last election that the Whigs will run in. And then we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So California has a lot of gold, and so Senator Stephen Douglas wants to build a transcontinental railroad from California to Illinois. And the outcome is that he also says there should be popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, which nullifies the Missouri Compromise. The green line there is a 3630 line. The Missouri Compromise said there'd be absolutely no slavery above that line, but if we allow those circled in red states to have popular sovereignty, therefore the potential of slavery, then that invalidates the compromise as we see that, right? And the effect of this is a bleeding Kansas and the eventual birth of the Republicans. Okie dokie. Then we have bleeding Kansas. So with popular sovereignty allowed in Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery people come rushing into the state to illegally vote. Because if they can toss a few votes in there, maybe they'll sway it the way that they want it to. Because at the time they don't have any form of electronic voting, it's going to be really hard to verify who the voters are. But then we have John Brown, our favorite radical abolitionist, and he uses violence to spread his anti-slavery views. There's a lot, I don't know how to explain it, it's just a lot of burning down houses, all that kind of stuff. It's relatively pretty bad, and it's commonly described as a political storm if you read up on it. And the effect of this is higher tensions over the borderline war and the caning of Sumter. So the caning of Sumter, bleeding Sumter, the summer of 1856, because it happened in summer, it's a pretty fun event, I'd say. So, this Senator Charles Sumner, he's like, yo, bleeding Kansas happened all because of Stephen Douglas and Andrew Butler. So Preston Brooks, he's like, Andrew Butler? That's my cousin. He holds his cane. He says he won a bet, so Brooks caned Sumner. And Sumner had to be carried away as he was bleeding and probably would have died if Brooks continued on a bit longer. And Sumner was fine in the end, but it shows how bad the political scene is getting. Even, I find it to be amazing that later on people sent mail to Preston Brooks, and it wasn't hate mail, it was more canes to cane Charles Sumner. And I think it's just an awesome event, even if it is a bit horrible. And we have the phrase, one man's trash is another man's political party. So the Whigs are already politically weak. We saw in that previous election how they died out, and how they were ultimately really split over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Because unlike the Democrats, who tend to be a bit more Southern, these Whigs aren't really that. So they become the Cotton Whigs and the Conscience Whigs, which are the Southern and Northern Whigs. The Southern Whigs join the Democrats, while the Northern Whigs join the Republicans, which is a newly forming party. The Republicans are the anti-slavery Whigs, as we just talked about earlier, the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, and the Abolitionists. Pretty much this is the anti-slavery party that we see. So the election of 56, the Republicans start running, and they did pretty well for their first election electoral. They got 38%, which isn't horrible. The previous election, Democrats got like 80%, you know? And then the popular vote, they've already got a third of the votes, which really is not bad. But we also see that the northern states were supporting the Republican Party, which is very, very significant. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why did the Republicans win the 1860 presidential election? And part of this is due to the Dred Scott case, or Dred Scott v. Sanford. So Dred Scott was a slave whose owner took him to many free territories for work. When his owner died, Dred Scott resided in free land, so he tried to sue for his freedom. But the outcome was that the Supreme Court ruled against him. Most likely low-key, because most of them owned slaves themselves, and he was made property of his owner's sister. And the effect was that slaves were legally declared property now by one of the most powerful branches of the judicial court. And so a lot of African Americans lose hope for their future. They believe there's nothing there. If they can't even live in a free territory for many, many years and then still get decided as slaves, what does that mean for them? Not to mention, now this means slavery is technically allowed in all free states, no matter what, Kansas, Nebraska, for example, that was popular sovereignty that would decide this state is a free state or a slave state. But now, it doesn't matter what the state is, slavery can still be allowed in it. Alright, so now we got the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We have Honest Abe and the Little Giant. They're both running for the senator of Illinois, and they had a lot of national attention on them because many debates focused on slavery itself, and they were both announced to be presidential debates, and they were opposite to each other. Stephen Douglas was quite pro-slavery, while Abraham Lincoln was against slavery. Well, he wasn't an abolitionist per se, but he was possibly part of the Free Soil Party. He didn't want the expansion of slavery, to say the least. And then we have John Brown's raid, or the raid on Harper's Ferry. Because John Brown, our beloved guy, he just said, hey, we're gonna raid a federal army and give guns to slaves so they can revolt. But it wasn't successful at all. Not many slaves showed up, but still, there were deaths revolving around slavery on both sides, and John Brown was executed for treason. And the effect of this is that it was a really hot topic for presidential debates, and the South was really scared of the North. They're really afraid of this radical abolitionism that John Brown showed. And this violent event really foreshadowed the Civil War, as many considered John Brown to either be a murderer or a martyr. Then we got President James Buchanan. Look, I rarely talk about a singular president, as you notice throughout this. I don't tend to mention their names a lot. I talk about specific events that the presidents then caused. But President James Buchanan is pretty significant. He was president from 1856 to 1860. And throughout this, he also went through the Panic of 1857, which is when the U.S. went into an economic depression. He didn't really do a lot because he thought the government shouldn't interfere with the economy. So the Republicans then, like on the other side, had genuine ideas how to help, so they gained a lot of popularity. This is how we see how Lincoln won in the future, and he promised he wouldn't rerun in the later election, and he followed through on that. So the Democrats really didn't know who to elect. They scrambled to find a candidate that ended up splitting up their votes, meaning they're a lot weaker already going into the election. Election of 1860. Lincoln won by a really good amount, but we see how the country is almost entirely sectionalized by this point. We see Republicans in the north, and also in Oregon and California. We see Constitutional Union right in the middle. Then a bit of a Northern Democrat in the Missouri. Then a lot of our Southern Democrats in the South. So, when this Republican gets elected, how do we think the South's gonna feel? And that's why the Civil War begins in April 1861. Now we have the effects of Lincoln's election. The Northerners, alright, they're pretty happy, they voted for him, they're good. Lincoln's pretty hyped. And then the Southerners decide they need to form their own country in order to protect their state rights. So, South Carolina secedes, and they're the first state to secede on December 20th, 1860. Then, I'm not going to read out all these states, but we have a lot of states to secede in January, and then Texas in February. Then we have the Battle of Fort Sumter, which starts the Civil War. In December of 1860, which is 5 days after South Carolina secedes, Major Robert Anderson stations himself and his men at Fort Sumter. He was really pro-slavery as a slave owner, but he was also loyal to the Union, and we see the Union is the North pretty much, and the Confederate is the South. And January 1861, supply lines are cut. I was trying to read up on this. I'm pretty sure this was not like North targeting South or anything like that. I think they were just cut randomly, and it was an unfortunate event. By April, Major Robert Anderson's like, oh god, we're gonna run out of food, aren't we? So, April 9th, Lincoln sends a supply ship, right? Jefferson Davis, he is the elected leader of the South. And he couldn't have those supplies get into the fort. He's like, oh, God's gonna make him stronger. But attacking the ship would be too suspicious, so he tried to order Anderson to surrender. Anderson refused. He's like, nope, this is our fort, we're chilling here. So just 3 days later, there's gunfire on the fort, and then I believe it was 37 hours the battle lasted. Anderson then surrenders. There weren't major casualties during the battle, but it's really significant because that's when we see a lot of states secede. So blue we have before Fort Sumter, that's when we had all of our dates, all these states are seeing around the same time. And then the purple is after this battle. So we have Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina added to this list. And so, the Civil War officially starts April 12th, 1861, which is when the gunfire was shot. Thank you for watching this. I know it's hard to study history sometimes, but it means a lot that you got through this. If you have any questions, let me down below. I'll try to answer them, and thank you.